Hey guys, and welcome back. We are concluding our discussion of evaluations by getting to the PowerPoint pertaining to rankings and comparisons. Now, rankings and comparisons are one of the more utilized sorts of evaluations, especially because we live in a culture that likes to sort of create lists and prioritize the best to worst sort of things. It kind of gives us options. It kind of gives us a range, but we have to be mindful of certain things, especially when we establish rankings or comparisons. So if you decide to establish a ranking or comparison, you got to be mindful of the following things. One, a subjective approach, meaning the type of opinion you might have because you have a particular bias towards something. The strength of your criteria, how well have you defined the categories of which you are assessing the topic, and then the types of data that you're using, a quantitative and qualitative combination, utilizing both statistical evidence and abstract sort of observations and testimony to help support what it is you are trying to evaluate. So when it comes to a subjective approach, keep in mind that we are all prone to love, follow, defend, and invest in the products, concepts, and ideologies that we have inherited or been exposed to. What does that mean? Well, we've all grown up in different types of communities and different types of households. What's great about America is that it is very diverse, meaning that we all like different things, primarily due to the type of things we've been exposed to. So you may have drank Coca-Cola your whole life and you love Coke over Pepsi. If you were from Chicago, you probably grew up loving the Bears or the Bulls. And if you're from the United States, you probably love the 4th of July, apple pie, baseball, or all things America. So you have to be mindful that not everybody shares your view. So simply to say, I like those things because I like them is not pushing the evaluation far enough. So be mindful of establishing those limited points of views. Example, America represents the best of everything. It's America. I've always drank Coke, therefore it beats Pepsi. Vikings suck, Lions suck. Don't even get me started on the Packers. The Bears. Remember that your criteria need to represent categories that are debatable and thought-provoking. So remember, the point of a thesis is to establish something that I can debate against, I can argue against. If you are clearly stating a personal subjective opinion without any evidence or support to back it up, it becomes very hard to expand on your evaluation. So let's observe some of the following rankings and see how they establish their criteria. So each of these particular examples, from video games to sports to movies to music to Time Magazine's most influential people, have a ranking system as to how they base their particular list. And they've established a certain set of criteria to equate to that. So for example, here when IMDb went on to address the top 100 movies of all time, this person went on to suggest the movies on this list are ranked according to their success, awards, and nominations, their popularity, and their true greatness from a directing/writing standpoint. To me, accuracy when making a top 10 or top 100 all-time list is extremely important. My lists are not based on my own personal favorites. They are based on the true greatness and or success of the person, place, and thing being ranked. So he first starts off with some clear-cut criteria in regards to popularity, awards, and nominations. Those things can be tracked. You can provide those as evidence. However, he gets a little ambiguous when he says that their true greatness, you need a little bit more explanation. What would really define what makes something truly great? So always make sure to clarify and to not be relatively vague. Here, when it comes to Empire Online, this is strictly based with a lot of quantitative background, statistics, things that can be quantified, numbers. 10,000 Empire readers, 150 of Hollywood's finest, and 50 key film critics voted in the most ambitious movie poll ever attempted. So here, Empire, in contrast to IMDb, utilized primarily a lot of their background in terms of their readership base, and they provided some authenticity by bringing in key film critics and 150 Hollywood's finest people who worked in film. So this adds a little bit more credibility to their discussion. When looking at the greatest video game of all time, this is a good example of how Slant Magazine established their criteria. One thing that you have to remember is that establishing parameters in terms of looking at time and place are also crucial when trying to confine your particular audience. So in this case, it's difficult to forget that quote-unquote all time, as video games are concerned, isn't a very long time at all. This fact poses something of a unique list-making challenge. How do you size up, let alone rank numerically, the history of a medium still more or less in its infancy? How, for instance, do you compare the limited efficiencies of an 8-bit side scroller to the gleaming HD vistas of a next-gen open world? How do you survey everything that video games are capable of, every idiosyncratic way they've been shaped and contorted, and come up with a list that accommodates all of it? How do you account for outmoded styles or formats or obsolete technologies or milestones beginning to show their age? The evolutionary considerations alone are staggering. Consider the extremes. How do you compare Portal to Pong? Well, it may be that this sort of flattening of historical perspective is impossible, at least without serious concessions to personal conviction. But in any case, those of us who contributed to this list felt it in our collective best interest not to tip the scales in favor of honoring the past. We wanted to exalt those games we each felt are most exemplary of the medium's virtues, whether they be richly emotional narrative experiences or invigorating bouts of tactile fun. It stands to reason that as this medium enters early maturity, it will reach new heights of artistry and sophistication. The landmarks and breakthroughs of gaming history, those prototypal games whose influence continues to loom over contemporary mechanics and design, are the shoulders on which every modern developer sits, forever stretching up to something new. In other words, video games keep getting better. So this is sort of a lead-in to this particular list that G4TV brought up, and that's a more thorough example of how to sort of define the limits and parameters of what you're talking about. Here, they clearly identify that we can't really make comparisons to games of the 70s and 80s to modern games because that's not a fair comparison. But if you define each decade by the particular walls or parameters or limitations that those decades faced, and then you place those games within those confinements, you can then come up with a more appropriate list. When we look at quantitative evaluations, we're looking at means of measurement, statistics, data. So remember, anything that can be quantified to help support what it is you are trying to evaluate. If you're looking at qualitative evaluations, we might address standards of evidence, various points of view, experts' arguments, and historical testimony. So things that we can look up, abstract points of views, other types of analysis or evaluations that have come from experts in their particular field. Comparisons are primarily meant for observing the gray area of conversation. In our current culture, camps are easily established to carry polarizing discussions. When developing a proper comparison, juxtapose discussion points that converse within the middle of the spectrum, not on two separate ends. Oftentimes, we will see that more refined and thought-provoking dialogues occur when there is more evidence and context presented. Refrain from knee-jerk reactions. So, when we look at some of these lists, it's very important to really define what our criteria are so that we can sort of meet in the middle. It's very easy to say that this movie's great because of the special effects and this movie's terrible because it has no special effects. But we're then missing out on all the other things that make movies great. So really try to hone in on what your lists are important. If you have to make them smaller, if you're focusing on something more specific, make sure you clarify that. Because a lot of times what becomes problematic with some of these lists is that they are very broad and they do not necessarily cover or explain why they came to their conclusion based on some of the criteria they've established. So when looking at ranking comparisons, again, be mindful of your subjective lens. Everyone likes things, they have their own opinions, they're entitled to them. But if you want to join an elevated conversation, you need to provide evidence, you need to provide testimony, you need to provide quantitative and qualitative data to help support your claim. Develop your criteria and establish your preliminary context. Preliminary context essentially just gives me some background information to the criteria that you're talking about in your introduction. Remember, that whenever you establish your criteria, what you establish in your intro needs to be developed in your body paragraphs. And if it's not, then it's going to appear to surface abruptly. So always make sure to clearly identify what it is you intend to talk about in your essay. Consider your topic to determine whether quantitative or qualitative data will be more appealing, and your countdown or discussion points do not have to be equal. So for example, number 10 on the list may have less information than number 1. So the best example I can provide is that a student did an evaluative list on the top NBA draft classes. He did the top 5 draft classes based on year and superstar power. He clearly identified his criteria, basing it on how many Hall of Famers came out of the draft, the total points accumulated, the type of star power they had. Those are clearly defined. But what he was able to do also is that because the number 1 list had more of these superstars and criteria fulfilling obligations, he was able to make the number 1 draft class on his list. That section was much more thorough than the number 5 section. So he ended up probably with closer to 8 or 9 sections opposed to just simply 5 paragraphs, especially because the final section was the most thorough. So keep these ideas in mind when you are establishing a ranking or comparison, if that's the route you choose to take. And also keep in mind that this type of evaluation is one of the types that people like to do because it allows you to get a variety of different things, and it allows you to kind of determine why you would define the top particular aspect of whatever it is you are going to be evaluating that you are interested in.